Chapter 4. A Hunger of Silence. The journey back from the winter court passed in silence. Cassian sat opposite Isolde in the carriage, his face turned toward the window, though she doubted he saw the moonlit landscape rushing past. His expression was carved from stone, his body unnaturally still even for a vampire. Only his eyes betrayed any life, garnet depths that occasionally flickered with some unnamed emotion when they inadvertently met hers. Isolde had attempted conversation once, asking about Lord Harrow and whether her intervention would cause problems. Cassian had answered with a single word, perhaps, before lapsing back into silence. So she too remained quiet, watching him from beneath lowered lashes, remembering the portrait in the palace corridor and the voice that had whispered in her mind. So, you're the one he chose to replace me. Replace whom? The woman in the painting? A previous consort? A lover? The questions burned in her throat, but she swallowed them down. This was not the time. Not when Cassian radiated such cold fury. Though whether directed at her or at himself, she couldn't tell. When they arrived at Valenhart Castle, he escorted her to the entrance hall, then stopped. "You should rest," he said, the first complete sentence he'd spoken since they'd left the court. "The journey has been taxing." "And you?" she asked, unable to keep the question contained. His eyes met hers briefly. "I have matters to attend to." "Cassian," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Not now, Isolde. We will speak. Later." With that, he turned and strode away, his tall figure disappearing down the shadowed corridor that led to the east wing, his private domain, which she had never been invited to enter. Isolde watched him go, a strange hollowness expanding in her chest. Then she made her way to her own chambers where Edith waited to help her undress. "Did you enjoy the court, my lady?" the maid asked, as she unfastened the crimson gown. "Enjoy is not the word I would choose," Isolde replied, wincing as the tight bodice released its grip on her ribs. "It was educational." Edith's hands paused momentarily. "I imagine it was," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The court can be challenging for mortals." "Have you been there?" Isolde asked, curious about this woman who served in a vampire household yet seemed so ordinary, so human. "Once," Edith said, resuming her work. "Many years ago, I accompanied my previous mistress." "Another consort?" Edith nodded, her expression shuddering. "Yes, she did not return." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Isolde wanted to ask more about this previous consort, about what had happened to her. But something in Edith's demeanour suggested the topic was closed. Instead, she asked, "How long have you served at Valenhart Castle?" "Longer than I care to remember," Edith replied, helping Isolde into a nightgown of pale blue silk. "I was born here, in the servants' quarters. My mother was a laundress, my father a groundskeeper. And they were human?" Edith's smile was thin. "Yes, my lady. The Valenharts have always employed humans for certain tasks. We are expendable, I suppose, but useful." There was a bitterness in her tone that Isolde had not heard before. She wondered what experiences had shaped this woman, what she had seen in her years of service to vampire masters. "Edith," she said carefully, "the woman in the portrait gallery, the one with gold eyes. Who was she?" The maid's hands stilled again, this time for longer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know who you mean, my lady." It was a lie. Isolde was certain of it. But before she could press further, Edith stepped back, her professional mask firmly in place once more. "Will there be anything else, my lady?" Isolde sighed, recognizing the futility of pursuing the subject. "No, thank you, Edith. You may go." After the maid departed, Isolde sat at her dressing table, brushing out her hair and contemplating her reflection in the mirror. The court had changed her, she realized. Or perhaps it had simply revealed what was already there, a strength she hadn't known she possessed, a defiance that had been dormant until now. She had stood up to Lord Harrow. She had navigated the treacherous waters of vampire politics. She had touched a portrait and heard a dead woman speak. And through it all, Cassian had watched her with those unreadable eyes, neither approving nor condemning, but always aware, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, or a threat he couldn't quite neutralize. What did he want from her? Why had he chosen her, if not for the reasons most vampires chose their consorts? The questions circled in her mind like restless birds, finding no place to land, no answers to satisfy them. Eventually she climbed into bed, extinguishing the lamp and letting darkness envelop her. But sleep remained elusive, chased away by memories of the court, of Eleanor's frightened eyes, of the woman in the portrait whose voice had whispered in her mind. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were troubled. Fragments of conversations she couldn't quite hear, faces that shifted from human to vampire and back again, and always at the edges a pair of garnet eyes watching, waiting, hungering. Morning brought no answers, but it did bring a surprise. When Isolde entered her sitting room after breakfast, she found a stack of books on the small table by the window. They hadn't been there the night before, and Edith, when questioned, claimed no knowledge of their appearance. There were 5 volumes in total, 3 leather-bound tomes with gilt lettering on their spines, 1 slim volume of what appeared to be poetry, and a small, unadorned journal bound in dark blue leather. No note accompanied them, but Isolde knew who had left them. The question was why. She examined each book carefully. The 3 larger volumes were histories of the vampire kingdoms, dry, academic texts that detailed the rise of the great houses, the wars that had shaped their territories, and the complex web of alliances and betrayals that constituted vampire politics. The poetry was more interesting, verses written in an ancient language with translations provided in the margins. They were love poems, she realized with surprise, passionate, sometimes violent declarations of devotion that spanned centuries, even millennia. But it was the journal that truly captured her attention. It contained no name, no indication of ownership, but when she opened it, she recognized the handwriting immediately, the same elegant script that had been on the note Cassian had left her after the binding ceremony, his journal. Or at least a portion of it. She hesitated, aware that reading it would be an invasion of his privacy. But he had left it for her, hadn't he? Deliberately placed it among the other books, knowing she would find it. Decision made, she settled into the window seat and began to read. The entries were not dated, and they were not chronological. They jumped from century to century, from place to place, as if the writer had opened the journal at random whenever the mood struck to record a thought or observation. Some entries were brief, a single line describing a sunset over a mountain range, or the scent of rain on stone. Others were longer, more detailed accounts of battles fought, journeys taken, discoveries made. But what struck Isolde most was the loneliness that permeated every page. The writer, Cassian, described a world of beauty and wonder, but always from the perspective of an outsider, an observer who could never truly be part of what he witnessed. One entry in particular caught her attention. I watched a family today, mother, father, 2 children, picnicking by the lake. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 5, was attempting to skip stones across the water. She failed repeatedly, growing more frustrated with each attempt. Then her father knelt beside her, took her small hand in his, and showed her how to flick her wrist just so. The stone skipped 4 times before sinking. The child's delight was incandescent. I found myself wondering what it would be like to experience such simple joy, to be capable of such uncomplicated love, to touch another being without calculating the risk of harm. These are useless thoughts, dangerous ones. I am what I am, and no amount of wishing will change that. The hunger is always there, just beneath the surface. The potential for destruction lives in every touch, every breath, every moment of weakness. Better to remain apart, better to observe than to participate, Better to hunger than to feed and find that the emptiness remains. Isolde closed the journal, her heart aching with a sympathy she hadn't expected to feel. Was this why Cassian kept his distance? Not out of coldness or disdain, but out of fear. Fear of his own nature, fear of the harm he might cause. She was still contemplating this when a knock sounded at her door. Not Edith's usual gentle tap, but something firmer, more authoritative. "Enter," she called, quickly setting the journal aside. The door opened to reveal Cassian himself, dressed in his customary black, his expression as unreadable as ever. But there was something different about him today, a tension in his shoulders, a wariness in his eyes. "You found the books," he said, his gaze flicking to the stack on the table. "Yes," she replied. "Thank you. They're illuminating." His mouth tightened slightly. "They should keep you occupied. I will be unavailable for the next few days." "Unavailable?" she repeated, frowning. "Why?" "I have matters to attend to," he said, the same evasion he'd offered the night before. "What matters?" His eyes narrowed at her persistence. "Castle business. Nothing that concerns you." "Everything in this castle concerns me," she countered. "I live here too, remember? By your choice, not mine." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps at her boldness, or irritation at being questioned. "The books contain information about vampire society that may be useful to you," he said, ignoring her comment. "I suggest you study them carefully. The histories, in particular, will help you understand the political landscape you now inhabit." "And the journal?" she asked, unable to resist. "What am I to learn from that?" His gaze sharpened, focusing on the small blue volume she'd set aside. For a moment she thought he might deny knowledge of it, or demand its return. Instead, he said, "That is for you to determine." "Why did you give it to me?" she pressed. "Why now?" He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he said, "Because you asked a question at the court, about why I chose you." "And the journal contains the answer?" "It contains context." Before she could respond, he turned to leave, his movements as fluid and graceful as always, but with an underlying tension that suggested restraint rather than ease. "Cassian," she called after him. "The woman in the portrait. The one at the palace. Who was she?" He paused at the threshold, his back to her, shoulders rigid. "No one of consequence," he said, the words clipped. "She spoke to me," Isolde said. "When I touched the painting, she said I was the one you chose to replace her." Now he did turn, his expression thunderous. "Impossible. The dead do not speak." "Then who was she? And why does her portrait hang in the royal palace?" His jaw tightened. "This conversation is over." "No," Isolde said, rising from her seat. "It's not. I'm tired of half-truths and evasions. If I'm to be your consort, your prisoner, then I deserve to know why. Why me? Why now? What happened to the woman in the portrait?" For a heartbeat she thought he might answer. His eyes held hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't name. Anger, certainly, but also something deeper, more complex. Pain, perhaps, or regret. Then his expression closed, becoming the mask she knew too well. "Read the books, Isolde," he said. "They contain all the answers you need." With that, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that brooked no argument. Isolde stared at the empty space where he had stood, frustration and determination warring within her. Then she picked up the journal again, determined to find the answers he refused to give. 3 days passed without a sign of Cassian. Isolde spent them reading, the histories, the poetry, and, most of all, the journal. She pored over every entry, searching for clues, for the context he had promised would explain his choice. What she found instead was a portrait of a man, or a being who had once been a man, trapped between worlds. Neither fully vampire nor fully human in his sensibilities, Cassian seemed to exist in a state of perpetual isolation. observing both societies, but belonging to neither. The journal entries spanned centuries, but certain themes recurred. His discomfort with vampire customs, particularly those involving mortals, his fascination with human art, literature, and music, his growing estrangement from his father and the court, and, most intriguingly, his experiments with alternative sources of sustenance. The deer provided adequate nourishment, though the taste was lacking. Animal blood sustains, but it does not satisfy. Still, it is preferable to the alternative. I have gone 3 months now without human blood. The hunger is manageable, if not pleasant. Father would call it weakness. Perhaps he is right, but I find I can no longer stomach the look in their eyes, the fear, the resignation, the hopelessness. It reminds me too much of my own reflection. This, then, was why she had never seen him feed, why he had never demanded her blood, as was his right under the binding. He was attempting to abstain from human blood entirely. But why? Was it moral compunction, aesthetic preference, or something more personal? The journal offered no clear answers, only more questions, and as the days passed without Cassian's presence, Isolde found herself growing restless, confined to her wing of the castle, with only books and her own thoughts for company. On the 4th night, unable to sleep, she decided to explore beyond her usual boundaries. The castle was vast, much of it unknown to her, and while certain areas were warded against her entry, others were merely discouraged. She dressed in a simple gown of dark blue, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the perpetual chill of the castle, and slipped out of her chambers. The corridors were silent, lit only by the occasional wall sconce that cast more shadows than light. She moved carefully, avoiding the creaking floorboards she'd learned to identify during her previous explorations. Her destination was the East Wing, Cassian's domain, which she had never been invited to enter. Not forbidden precisely, but understood to be private, off-limits. But if he wouldn't come to her with answers, she would go to him. The passage connecting the central part of the castle to the East Wing was a long gallery lined with portraits, ancestors of the Valenhart line, she presumed, though their features were so similar across the centuries that they might have been the same person painted again and again, with only slight variations in clothing and background. At the end of the gallery stood a pair of massive doors carved with intricate scenes of hunt and battle. They were slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling through the gap. Isolde approached cautiously, her heart beating faster with each step. She had no plan beyond finding Cassian, confronting him with the questions that had been building within her since the court. But now, faced with the threshold of his private space, she hesitated. What if he was feeding? What if he was not alone? What if he was furious at her intrusion? Before she could decide whether to proceed or retreat, a sound reached her ears, music, faint but unmistakable. A piano played with skill but also with a melancholy that made her chest ache. She recognized the piece, Chopin's Nocturne, in C-sharp minor, one of her own favorites. She had played it herself in the music room during those first days after the binding. Had he heard her? Was this an echo of her own performance, or a response to it? Drawn by the music, she pushed the door open wider and slipped through. The room beyond was a study, vast and elegant, with walls lined with books from floor to ceiling. A fire burned in a massive hearth, casting warm light over leather chairs, a desk of polished mahogany, and, in the far corner, a grand piano at which sat Cassian, his back to the door, his hands moving over the keys with a grace that belied their strength. He wore no jacket, only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His dark hair was slightly dishevelled, as if he'd run his hands through it in frustration or thought. He looked human, vulnerable even. Isolde stood frozen in the doorway, torn between the desire to retreat before he noticed her and the impulse to step forward. to make her presence known. The decision was made for her when Cassian's hands stilled on the keys, his head tilting slightly. "I know you're there," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the room. "Your heartbeat gives you away." Isolde swallowed, then stepped fully into the study, closing the door behind her. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, though of course she had. "And yet, here you are," he replied, still not turning to face her. "In my private study, uninvited." "You've been avoiding me," she said, moving further into the room, "for 4 days. I told you I would be unavailable." "Why?" she asked, stopping a few feet behind him. "What are you hiding from?" Now he did turn, his movement so swift it startled her. His eyes were darker than usual, the garnet deepened to something closer to blood. "I am not hiding," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I am working, governing, fulfilling my duties as heir to this domain." "Is that all?" she challenged, emboldened by the emotion she sensed beneath his controlled exterior. "Or are you avoiding me specifically?" His jaw tightened. "You should return to your chambers." "No," she said simply. "Not until you answer my questions. I owe you no explanations." "You owe me the truth," she countered. "About why you chose me. About the woman in the portrait. About why you keep your distance when the binding is meant to create closeness." The last word hung between them, laden with implications neither had voiced until now. Cassian rose from the piano bench in one fluid motion, his height and presence suddenly overwhelming in the firelit room. "The binding is a formality," he said, "a political necessity, nothing more." "Then why me?" she pressed, refusing to be intimidated. "Why not any other girl from the village? Why go through the charade of the blood festival if all you needed was a warm body to satisfy tradition?" His expression darkened. "You know nothing of tradition or necessity." "Then enlighten me," she said, taking a step closer. "Tell me why you chose me, brought me here, bound me to you, only to ignore me, avoid me, treat me like an unwelcome guest rather than a consort." For a long moment he simply looked at her, his eyes burning with that unnamed emotion she'd glimpsed before. Then abruptly, he turned away, moving to stand before the fire. "It doesn't matter why I chose you," he said, his voice low. "You're here now. That's all that matters." "It matters to me," she insisted, following him. "I left everything behind, my home, my family, my future. I deserve to know why." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flames as if they held answers she couldn't see. Frustration surged within her. "Is it because I look like her? The woman in the portrait?" That got a reaction. His head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with a flash of genuine surprise. "What? No. Then who was she?" Isolde demanded. "Why did she say I was chosen to replace her?" "She said nothing," Cassian replied, his voice hard. "She is dead. Has been for centuries." Then I imagined her voice the way she looked at me from the canvas. He turned fully to face her now, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been concern. "What exactly did you hear?" Isolde hesitated, then decided on honesty. She said, "So, you're the one he chose to replace me." Cassian went very still, the kind of stillness only vampires could achieve. A complete absence of movement, not even the rise and fall of breath. Then, slowly, he said, "That's impossible." "I know what I heard," Isolde insisted. "Who was she, Cassian? What happened to her?" He moved suddenly, crossing the space between them in a heartbeat, his hands gripping her upper arms with a force that was just short of painful. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "The dead do not speak. What you heard was something else. A trick, a spell, a manifestation of your own fears. But not her. She is gone." The vehemence in his voice, the barely contained emotion in his eyes, told Isolde more than his words. Whoever the woman had been, she had mattered to him. Deeply. "You cared for her," she said softly. "The woman in the portrait." His grip tightened momentarily, then released as he stepped back. That is not your concern. It is if I'm her replacement, Isolde countered. If that's why you chose me. I did not choose you because of her, he interrupted, his voice sharp. I chose you because you were suitable. Suitable, she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. Like a piece of furniture or a horse. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She demanded. What made me suitable when dozens of other girls were passed over? He turned away again, his shoulders tense beneath the white shirt. You were different, he said finally. You didn't fear me. Not like the others. I was terrified, she admitted. I just didn't show it. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though she could only see his profile. Exactly. Courage, even in fear. Dignity, even in captivity. And he hesitated, then continued. A mind of your own. Not just a vessel for blood, but a person. With thoughts, opinions, a will. Most humans have those qualities, she pointed out. Most humans don't display them when faced with a vampire lord, he countered. They become less, reduced by fear to their most basic instincts. But you... He turned to look at her again, his eyes softer now. You remained yourself. Complete, undiminished. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to her, and it left her momentarily speechless. She had expected many answers, political advantage, physical attraction, even random chance, but not this. Not admiration. So you chose me because I stood up to you, she said slowly, because I wasn't cowed. Partly, he acknowledged, and partly because... He trailed off, his gaze shifting away from hers. Because? She prompted. He shook his head. It doesn't matter. The choice is made. The binding is done. Frustration surged again. Always he retreated just when she thought she might be getting somewhere. Why won't you tell me the whole truth? She demanded. What are you afraid of? His eyes snapped back to hers, suddenly hard. I am not afraid. Aren't you? She challenged. You avoid me. You refuse to feed from me, though that's the purpose of a consort. You give me your journal but won't explain its contents. You answer my questions with half-truths and evasions. If not fear, what is it that holds you back? For a long moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a suddenness that startled her, he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that belied their strength. You want to know what holds me back? He asked, his voice low and intense. This. And before she could respond, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, nor a tentative one. It was hungry, desperate, as if he'd been starving for the taste of her. His lips were cool against hers, but they warmed quickly, and when she gasped in surprise, his tongue swept into her mouth, deepening the kiss with a passion that left her breathless. Isolde's hands came up instinctively, gripping the front of his shirt as her knees threatened to buckle. She had been kissed before, chaste, awkward exchanges with village boys. But nothing like this. Nothing that made her blood sing in her veins, her heart race in her chest, her body arch toward his as if seeking more contact, more heat, more of him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Cassian tore himself away, stepping back so quickly he was halfway across the room before she could blink. His chest heaved with unnecessary breath, his eyes wild, his expression a mixture of desire and self-loathing. That, he said, his voice ragged, is what I fear. What I must control. What I cannot allow myself to want. Isolde stood frozen, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her body humming with a desire she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Why? She whispered. Why can't you want me? His laugh was harsh, without humor. Because I am not like other vampires, Isolde. I do not take small sips, delicate tastes. When I feed, I consume. When I want, I possess completely, utterly. His eyes burned into hers. And I would destroy you in the process. You don't know that, she said, taking a step toward him. He held up a hand, stopping her. I do know. I have seen it happen. I have caused it to happen. The woman in the portrait, she thought. Was that what he meant? Had he loved her, fed from her, destroyed her? Before she could ask, a sharp pain lanced through her palm, the binding mark, suddenly hot and throbbing. She looked down to see a thin line of blood welling from the centre of the mark, as if it had split open. You're bleeding, Cassian said, his voice suddenly tight, strained. Isolde looked up to find him staring at her hand, his eyes fixed on the small trickle of blood with an intensity that made her shiver. His pupils had dilated, nearly swallowing the garnet iris, and his breathing had become shallow, rapid. It's nothing, she said, closing her hand into a fist. Just a scratch. But Cassian wasn't listening. He was watching the blood seep between her fingers, his expression transforming from controlled desire to something darker, more primal. His lips parted slightly, revealing the tips of fangs that seemed to lengthen as she watched. Cassian, she said, uncertain now, a flicker of fear stirring in her chest. He took a step toward her, then another, his movements no longer fluid but jerky, as if he were fighting against some invisible force. His eyes never left her closed fist, tracking the blood that dripped slowly onto the carpet. Let me see, he said, his voice barely recognizable, deeper, rougher, with an undertone that vibrated in her bones. Instinctively, she clutched her hand closer to her chest. It's fine. It's already stopping. Let me see. Each word was bitten off, forced through clenched teeth. She hesitated, then slowly extended her hand, palm up, revealing the small cut that bisected the binding mark. It wasn't deep, but it continued to bleed steadily, the blood bright against her pale skin. Cassian made a sound, half groan, half growl, and reached for her hand with both of his. His touch was gentle, at odds with the hunger in his eyes as he turned her palm this way and that, examining the wound. You should go, he said, though he made no move to release her. Now, before I... He broke off, his grip tightening as another drop of blood welled up. Before you what? Isolde asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes lifted to hers, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Desire, yes, but also a desperate, aching need that went beyond physical hunger. Before I take what isn't freely given, he said. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. She knew what he was asking. Permission to feed, to taste her blood, to satisfy the hunger that was clearly tormenting him. Slowly, deliberately, she uncurled her fingers, offering her bleeding palm more fully. What if it is freely given? She asked. His eyes widened, then darkened with a heat that made her skin flush. Isolde, he said, her name a warning and a plea. I'm your consort, she said, bound to you by blood and law. This is what I'm here for, isn't it? No, he said, the word sharp. That's not why I chose you. Then why did you? He didn't answer, his gaze dropping back to her palm, to the blood that continued to well up from the small cut. His thumbs traced circles on her wrist just above the pulse point, and she could feel his restraint in the slight tremor of his hands. Cassian, she said softly, look at me. Reluctantly, he raised his eyes to hers. I'm offering, she said, not because of the binding, or duty, or fear, but because I want to understand. I want to know what it's like, what you're like. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, searching her face for... what? Deception? Reluctance? Fear? Then, with a movement so swift she barely saw it, he lifted her hand to his mouth and ran his tongue along the cut. The sensation was electric, a jolt of pleasure pain that shot up her arm and spread throughout her body. She gasped, her free hand clutching at his shoulder for support as her knees threatened to buckle. Cassian made a sound deep in his throat, satisfaction, hunger, need, and drew her closer, his mouth closing over the wound, sucking gently. His eyes remained open, locked on hers, watching her reaction as he fed. And what a reaction it was. Isolde had expected pain, perhaps discomfort. What she felt instead was a building heat, a languid pleasure that spread from her palm to her core, making her body heavy and light at the same time. Her head fell back, her eyes half closing as sensation overwhelmed thought. "Cassian," she breathed, his name a plea for something she couldn't name. He responded by pulling her closer still, his free arm wrapping around her waist, supporting her as he continued to feed. His tongue laved the cut, gathering every drop of blood, and each stroke sent another wave of pleasure through her. It was intimate in a way she hadn't anticipated, more intimate than the kiss had been, more revealing. She could feel his hunger, his need, his struggle for control. And beneath it all, a tenderness that surprised her, a care that belied his earlier words about consumption and destruction. Then, abruptly, he released her hand and stepped back, breaking all contact. His breathing was ragged, his eyes still dark with hunger, but his expression was one of shock, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't," Isolde interrupted, her own voice unsteady. "Don't apologize. I offered. I wanted it." He shook his head, backing away further. "You don't understand. That was... I nearly lost control. If I had taken more..." "But you didn't," she pointed out. "You stopped. This time," he said grimly. "But the hunger, it grows. Each taste makes the next harder to resist." She looked down at her palm. The cut had stopped bleeding, the edges already beginning to close. Vampire saliva, she knew, contained properties that accelerated healing. "Is that what happened to her?" she asked quietly. "The woman in the portrait? You lost control?" His expression shuttered, all emotion wiped away as if it had never been. "This conversation is over," he said, his voice cold. "Return to your chambers, Isolde, and do not come here again uninvited." The dismissal stung, all the more for the intimacy they had just shared. "Cassian, go," he said, turning away from her. "Please." It was the please that decided her, a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She would not push him further, not tonight. "Good night, then," she said softly, moving toward the door. He didn't respond, his back to her, his posture rigid with self-control. As she reached the threshold, she paused, looking back at his solitary figure silhouetted against the fire. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me the truth even if you won't speak it." Then she was gone, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving him alone with his hunger and his silence. Chapter 5. The First Bite. 3 days after the incident in Cassian's study, the storm arrived. It began as a distant rumble beyond the mountains, a darkness on the horizon that spread like ink across parchment until it swallowed the perpetual twilight of the vampire realm. By late afternoon, the wind had risen to a howl, bending ancient trees until they groaned, driving icy rain against the castle walls with such force that it sounded like thousands of skeletal fingers tapping at the windows. Isolde stood at her bedroom window, watching lightning split the blackened sky. Each flash illuminated the landscape in stark relief. The skeletal forest, the jagged mountains, the sheer cliff that fell away beneath the castle's eastern face. In those brief moments of clarity, the world seemed both more real and more dreamlike, as if the lightning revealed truths the darkness concealed. Thunder followed, so deep and resonant she felt it in her bones. Her hand rose unconsciously to her other palm, tracing the binding mark that had bled 3 nights ago. The wound had healed completely, leaving no trace of the cut, but she still felt the echo of Cassian's mouth on her skin, the shocking pleasure of his feeding. He had avoided her since that night, as she had known he would. No more books appeared at her door, no more coincidental meetings in the corridors. Even Edith, when questioned, claimed ignorance of the master's whereabouts. But Isolde knew he was watching. She could feel his presence sometimes, a prickling at the nape of her neck, a shadow glimpsed from the corner of her eye, quickly gone when she turned to look. He was keeping his distance, but he hadn't abandoned his surveillance. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the window panes in their leaded frames. The storm was directly overhead now, its fury unleashed on the castle as if seeking entry. Isolde shivered, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The castle was always cold, but tonight the chills seemed to penetrate deeper, reaching for her bones, her heart, her soul. She turned from the window, intending to go to the music room where a fire would be lit, where she might find comfort in the piano's familiar voice. But as she reached for the door, a flicker of movement in the corridor beyond caught her attention. Not Cassian. The shadow was wrong, too bulky, too ungraceful. And it was coming closer. Isolde hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. The corridor outside her chambers should be empty at this hour. The servants had retired to their quarters in the lower levels, and Cassian was deliberately keeping his distance. So who or what was moving in the shadows beyond her door? Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting her shadow long and distorted against the far wall. In that brief moment of brightness, she saw something through the gap beneath the door, a darker shadow pausing, as if waiting. Thunder followed, and with it came a sound that raised the hair on her arms, a low, guttural growl, too deep for any natural beast, too hungry for any sane mind. Isolde backed away from the door, her heart suddenly racing. She glanced around the room, searching for something, anything that might serve as a weapon. But there was nothing except decorative items, a silver brush, a porcelain figurine, a letter opener. The letter opener. She snatched it from the writing desk, its blade pitifully small but better than nothing. She held it tightly, backing toward the window, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the door. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a scratching at the wood, claws or nails, dragging downward with deliberate slowness. "Who's there?" she called, striving to keep her voice steady. "Identify yourself." No answer, only that inhuman growl, deeper now, vibrating through the wood of the door. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant of illumination, Isolde saw the doorknob turn. She raised the letter opener, her knuckles white around its handle, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "I am consort to Prince Cassian," she said, infusing her voice with all the authority she could muster. "Protected by blood law and royal decree, harm me, and his vengeance will be—" The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, the sound lost in a simultaneous crack of thunder. In the doorway stood a figure, man-shaped but barely recognizable as once human, tall, gaunt to the point of emaciation, with skin stretched tight over bones and muscle, eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness, and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face, lined with double rows of needle-sharp teeth. A vampire, but unlike any Isolde had seen before. Not like the elegant nobles of the court, nor the disciplined guards of the castle. This creature was feral, driven by hunger or madness, or both. It stepped into the room, movements jerky yet preternaturally swift, head tilted at an unnatural angle as it studied her. Its clothes, once a guard's uniform, Isolde realized, were torn and stained with what could only be blood. "Pretty," it hissed, the word barely recognizable through those teeth. "Warm. Full." Isolde pressed herself against the window, the letter opener held before her in a hand that shook despite her efforts to control it. "Stay back," she warned, knowing it was futile. "My lord will—" "Lord gone," the creature rasped, taking another step toward her. "Lord Hunt! No one hear pretty scream." It lunged. Isolde slashed wildly with the letter opener, catching it across one withered cheek. The creature howled, more in rage than pain, as black blood welled from the shallow cut. Its hand shot out, impossibly fast, knocking the makeshift weapon from her grasp, sending it skittering across the floor. Then it was on her, forcing her back against the window with such strength that the glass cracked behind her. Its breath was putrid, the stench of old blood and decay washing over her as its jaws gaped wide, revealing those terrible teeth descending toward her throat. Isolde screamed, struggling against its hold, but it was like fighting stone. Its hands gripped her arms with bruising force, pinning her in place as its head lowered, teeth scraping against her skin. And then it was gone, torn away with such violence that Isolde stumbled forward, nearly falling. Cassian stood in the centre of the room, the feral vampire dangling from his grip, feet kicking uselessly a foot above the floor. His hand was clamped around the creature's throat, slowly crushing its windpipe, though vampires had no need to breathe. "Garvith," Cassian said, his voice colder than Isolde had ever heard it, "you forget yourself." The creature, Garvith, clawed at Cassian's arm, leaving bloody furrows that healed almost instantly. It snarled, still struggling despite the crushing grip, on its throat. "Hungry," it managed to rasp. "So hungry. She bleeds sweet. Smells like sunlight." "She is mine," Cassian said, tightening his grip until bones cracked audibly. "Bound to me, protected by me. And you dared to touch her." He threw the creature across the room with such force that it crashed through the armoire, splintering wood and shattering mirror glass. Before it could recover, Cassian was on it again, hauling it upright, his face a mask of cold fury. "Please," Garvith wheezed, suddenly cowering. "Didn't know. Hungry. So hungry. The cells, they don't feed us enough. Just a taste. Just one." "Silence," Cassian commanded, and the creature's jaw snapped shut as if physically forced. "You will never taste her blood. You will never look upon her face again." With a swift, brutal movement, he drove his hand into the creature's chest, through muscle and bone, and withdrew something dark and pulsing, its heart. Garvith stared at the organ in horrified fascination, mouth working soundlessly, body already beginning to grey and wither. "For your betrayal," Cassian said, "death would be merciful. Instead you will serve." He raised the heart to his mouth and bit deeply, his teeth sinking into the muscle with savage precision. Black blood flowed over his lips, down his chin, staining his shirt. He swallowed once, then returned the heart to the creature's chest, not pushing it back inside, but pressing it against the wound. Words in an ancient language rolled from his tongue, guttural and somehow wrong, as if the human mouth was not designed to produce such sounds. The heart in his hand glowed briefly, then withered, blackening like a fruit left too long in the sun. Garvith screamed, the sound cutting off abruptly as his body collapsed in on itself, skin greying, muscle withering, until nothing remained but a husk. Not dust, as Isolde might have expected, but a desiccated corpse, its eyes wide and staring, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Cassian stood over it for a moment, his breathing heavy, his eyes still burning with that terrible rage. Then, slowly, he turned to face Isolde. She flinched involuntarily at the sight of him, blood smeared across his mouth and chin, his eyes glowing with unnatural brightness, his expression still caught between fury and something darker, more primal. He saw her reaction and stepped back, turning away slightly, as if to shield her from the sight of what he had become. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, controlled with obvious effort. Isolde raised a hand to her throat, where the creature's teeth had scraped her skin. Her fingers came away with a smear of blood. Not much, just enough to show that the skin had been broken. "A scratch," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Nothing serious." Cassian's head snapped around at the scent of her blood, his nostrils flaring, his eyes fixing on her throat with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He took a step toward her, then stopped abruptly, hands clenching at his sides. "You're bleeding," he said, the words strained, as if each one cost him. Barely, she replied, pressing her hand to the small wound. It's already stopping. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the taut line of his jaw, the battle raging in his eyes between hunger and restraint. Cassian, she said softly, taking a step toward him. It's all right. I'm all right. He shook his head, backing away further. No, you don't understand. The blood, your blood, it's... He broke off, turning away completely. I should go. Guards will come to remove... That. You should rest. Tomorrow I'll arrange for you to be moved to more secure chambers with better protection. Wait, Isolde said, crossing the room to stand behind him. Don't go. Not yet. He remained facing away, his shoulders rigid with tension. It's not safe. I'm not safe. Not now. Not with your blood. She reached out, her hand hovering just above his shoulder, not quite touching. You saved me, she said. You protected me. I should have been here sooner, he replied, self-recrimination heavy in his voice. I should have known Garvith had escaped containment. I should have... You came when it mattered, she interrupted. You stopped him before he could... She couldn't finish the sentence, the reality of how close she'd come to death suddenly hitting her with full force. Her knees buckled, delayed shock setting in as adrenaline receded. Cassian turned just in time to catch her, his movements so swift she didn't even see him move. One moment she was falling, the next she was in his arms, cradled against his chest as if she weighed nothing. He carried her to the bed, setting her down with gentle care, then immediately stepped back, creating distance between them. But not before she felt the tremor that ran through him at their contact, saw the way his eyes darted to her throat, where blood still seeped from the shallow wound. You hunger, she said, not a question but a statement. His jaw tightened. Always, he admitted. But it doesn't matter. I have control. Like you did in your study, she asked, remembering the taste of his mouth on her palm, the pleasure that had coursed through her as he fed. His expression darkened. That was a mistake, one I won't repeat. It didn't feel like a mistake, she said, her voice soft but certain. It felt right, like completion of something that had been left unfinished. Isolde, he said, her name half warning, half plea. You don't know what you're saying. The feeding? It affects humans in ways they don't expect. It can create feelings that aren't real, desires that are merely echoes of the vampire's hunger. Is that what you tell yourself? She asked, sitting up straighter. That what I feel isn't real? That it's just some side effect of your feeding? He didn't answer, his gaze moving to the window, where lightning still flickered across the storm-black sky. You said you chose me because I remained myself, she continued, because I wasn't reduced by fear. Don't reduce me now by dismissing my feelings as nothing but a vampire's thrall. That got his attention, his eyes snapping back to hers. I'm not, he began, then stopped, reconsidering. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? She pressed. What, are you so afraid of, Cassian? That I'll reject you? Or that I won't? He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the drumming of rain against the window and the distant rumble of thunder. Finally he said, both. The honesty of the admission surprised her, and she softened, patting the edge of the bed beside her. Sit with me, she said. Please. I don't want to be alone right now. He hesitated, glancing at the desiccated corpse still lying amid the wreckage of the armoire. I should call the guards. This mess needs to be cleared away. It can wait, she said. Just stay. For a little while. After another moment of hesitation, he moved to sit beside her, though he maintained a careful distance, his body held with the rigid control she had come to recognize as his defense against his own nature. What was he? She asked, nodding toward the corpse. Garvith, you knew him. Cassian's expression tightened. He was a guard once, one of the most loyal. But the hunger, it affects some vampires differently, makes them feral, mindless. We keep them contained for their own safety as well as others. but sometimes they escape. And you, she paused, uncertain how to phrase it. What you did to him, was that death? No, he said, his voice flat. Worse than death. I bound his soul to service. He will rise again, but with no will of his own. A thrall, bound to obey whoever holds dominion over his heart, his mouth twisted. In this case, me. I didn't know vampires could do that, she said, a chill running through her at the implications. To be not just killed, but enslaved for eternity. Most can't, he replied. It's an ability passed down through my bloodline, one of many my father prizes. She wanted to ask more about these abilities, about his bloodline, but another question pressed more urgently. He said you were hunting. Where were you? Cassian's gaze shifted away, a muscle in his jaw working. Feeding, he admitted finally. I go to the forest when the hunger becomes too distracting. Animal blood sustains, though it doesn't satisfy. Because you won't feed from humans. I won't feed from innocents, he corrected. There are willing donors in the village, those who serve vampire houses for coin or protection. But he hesitated, then continued. I don't trust myself. Not since. He trailed off, but Isolde could fill in the blank. Not since the woman in the portrait. Not since whatever had happened that he still refused to speak of directly. You trusted yourself with me, she pointed out. In your study. That was different, he said. A small amount from your hand. Not your throat. Not directly from the vein. As he spoke, his gaze drifted to the wound on her neck, still seeping blood, though slowly now. She saw his pupils dilate, heard the slight catch in his breath, felt the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, leaning toward her, then forcing himself back. It calls to you, she said softly. My blood. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. More than others? Another nod, more reluctant. Why? He tore his gaze away from her throat, looking instead at his own hands, clenched into fists on his thighs. I don't know, he said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Some humans simply have blood that resonates more strongly with certain vampires. It's why the binding works at all. A compatibility of essence. So I'm compatible with you, she said, a strange warmth unfurling in her chest at the thought. Not just chosen at random, not just a political necessity, but somehow fundamentally suited to him in ways neither of them fully understood. Yes, he admitted. More than I expected. More than I've experienced before. Is that why you've been avoiding me? Because the hunger is stronger? He was silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on his hands. Then, with what seemed like great effort, he looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Partly, he said, but also because of what happened when I fed from you. What you felt. Pleasure, she said simply. His eyes darkened at the word. It's not natural, he said. Humans shouldn't find pleasure in being prey. It's a vampire ability, to make the feeding painless, even pleasurable, to ensure compliance. But with you, it was more than compliance, she finished for him. It was ecstasy. The word hung between them, charged with meaning, with memory. Cassian's breathing had deepened, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her skin flush. That's what frightens you, she realized suddenly. Not that I'll reject you, or even that you'll lose control, but that I'll welcome it, that I'll want more. He didn't deny it, which was answer enough. Outside, lightning struck somewhere very close, perhaps one of the castle's towers, illuminating the room in stark white light. Thunder crashed immediately after, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundation of the castle. And in that moment of chaos, of nature's fury, Isolde made a decision. She reached up and pulled aside the collar of her nightgown, exposing the curve of her throat, the small wound still wet with blood. Feed from me, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Properly this time. Cassian went utterly still, not even the pretense of breath moving his chest. "No," he said, the word barely audible. "Why not? You're hungry. I'm willing. And after what just happened..." She gestured toward the ruined armoire, the desiccated corpse. "I need connection, reassurance, something to chase away the fear." "There are other ways," he began, but she cut him off. "Not like this," she said. "Not something that will bind us closer. That's what the feeding does, isn't it? Strengthens the bond between us?" He nodded reluctantly. "Yes. Each feeding deepens the connection, makes it harder to break." "Then feed," she said, tilting her head slightly to better expose her throat. "Make me yours in truth, not just in name." Cassian's control visibly frayed, his body leaning toward her of its own volition, his eyes fixed on the pulse that beat steadily at the base of her throat. "Isolde," he whispered, her name a benediction and a curse. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm asking you to trust me," she said, "as I'm trusting you." For a long moment he remained frozen, balanced on the knife edge of decision. Then, with a sound that was half surrender, half despair, he moved closer, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, the other settling at her waist. "If it hurts," he said, his voice rough with restraint, "tell me to stop, if you feel faint, or afraid, or..." He paused, struggling for words. "If anything feels wrong, say so immediately. Promise me." "I promise," she said, her pulse quickening as he drew her closer, her body responding to his proximity in ways that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. He lowered his head slowly, his breath cool against her skin as his lips brushed the curve of her throat. She felt the sharp points of his fangs scrape lightly against her pulse, testing, preparing. "Breathe," he murmured against her skin. "Relax. It will hurt less if you're not tense." She did as instructed, drawing in a deep breath, forcing her muscles to release their tension. His hand at her waist moved to her back, supporting her, drawing her closer still until she was nearly in his lap, her body curved against his. "Cassian," she whispered, her hand finding his shoulder, gripping tightly as his fangs pressed more firmly against her skin. "I have you," he responded. His voice deepened to something not quite human. "Always." Then he bit. The initial pain was sharp, intense, a burning sting that made her gasp and stiffen in his arms, but it lasted only a heartbeat before a wave of pleasure washed through her, so powerful that her vision blurred, her body arching involuntarily against his. He made a sound against her throat, satisfaction and hunger mingled, and his arms tightened around her, holding her steady as he drank. Each pull of his mouth sent another surge of pleasure through her body, radiating outward from the point of connection, washing away thought, fear, memory, leaving only sensation and a bone-deep certainty that this was right. This was meant to be. But there was more. As Cassian fed, as the connection between them deepened with each swallow of her blood, Isolde began to see, not with her eyes, but with some inner sense that transcended ordinary perception. Images flashed through her mind, memories she realized but not her own. Cassian's memories, flowing into her consciousness as her blood flowed into his body. A boy with garnet eyes standing in snow, watching a castle burn in the distance. A young man kneeling before a throne of bone and silver, pledging fealty to a king with eyes like winter midnight. A warrior on a battlefield surrounded by the fallen, his sword dripping with blood that wasn't red but black. And a woman, the woman from the portrait lying in his arms, her golden eyes filled with love and terror as blood streamed from a wound at her throat, staining her gown, staining his hands. Too much blood, far too much. The last image was so vivid, so filled with grief and guilt that Isolde cried out, her hand tightening on Cassian's shoulder in distress rather than pleasure. Immediately he pulled away, his mouth leaving her throat with visible effort, his eyes wild with a mixture of hunger and concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice rough, lips stained with her blood. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she said, reaching up to touch his face, to ground herself in the present rather than the terrible past she had glimpsed. No, it's just... I saw... What? He demanded, his body tensing beneath her touch. What did you see? You, she said simply. Your memories. The woman, the one from the portrait. She died in your arms? Cassian went very still, his eyes widening with shock and something that might have been fear. That's not possible, he said. The feeding doesn't... It doesn't work that way. Vampire takes blood, memories, life, not the other way around. I saw her, Isolde insisted. Golden eyes, black hair, beautiful, and dying because... She hesitated, uncertain, the memory already fading like a dream upon waking. Because you couldn't stop. Because the hunger was too strong. His face drained of what little colour it had, and he pushed her away gently but firmly, rising from the bed to pace across the room like a caged predator. No, he said, the word sharp with denial. No, you couldn't have seen that. No one knows. No one. Cassian, she said, rising to follow him, though her legs felt weak, her head light from the blood loss. It's all right. I understand now. Why you've been so careful. Why you're afraid of losing control. He turned to face her, his expression ravaged by emotions too complex to name. You understand nothing, he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only a bone-deep weariness. If you did, you wouldn't be standing there, offering yourself to me like... He broke off, shaking his head. Like salvation. Not salvation, she corrected quietly. Connection. Understanding. Something neither of us has had in a very long time, I think. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face as if looking for something he couldn't quite believe was there. You should be afraid of me, he said finally, after what you saw, after what I did to her. I am afraid, Isolde admitted, but not of you, of what's happening between us, of how much I want it to continue despite everything. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, the anguish in his eyes, the blood still staining his mouth, the tightly leashed power in his stance. He looked both more and less than human in that moment, a creature of darkness and light, of cruelty and compassion, of hunger and restraint. And she wanted him. All of him, every contradictory, complicated, dangerous part. The bond is affecting you, he said, though he sounded as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The feeding creates a false sense of intimacy, of desire. It will fade. Will it? She asked, taking a step toward him. Or is that what you tell yourself to justify keeping your distance, to avoid risking your heart again? His jaw tightened. My heart is not at risk, he said coldly. It stopped beating centuries ago. Liar, she said softly, taking another step closer. I felt it when you fed from me. Not its beat, but its presence, its hunger. Not for blood, but for connection, for understanding, for... She hesitated, then finished. For love. The word hung between them, as dangerous as a drawn sword, as fragile as a cobweb. Cassian's expression shuttered, all emotion wiped away as if it had never been. You should rest, he said, his voice distant, formal. The feeding takes a toll on mortals. Sleep. Recover your strength. We'll speak again when you're... yourself. I am myself, she insisted, more than I've ever been. But he was already turning away, moving toward the door with that preternatural grace that reminded her of his otherness, his inhumanity. Cassian, she called after him, a note of desperation entering her voice. Don't go, not like this, not without... She trailed off, unsure what she was asking for. Acknowledgement, reassurance, something to indicate that what had passed between them meant as much to him as it did to her. He paused at the threshold, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. Guards will be posted outside your door, he said, his voice carefully neutral. No one will disturb you tonight. Then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, leaving Isolde alone with the ruined armoire, the desiccated corpse, and the echo of a connection too profound to be denied yet too dangerous to be embraced. She sank back onto the bed, suddenly exhausted, her body heavy from blood loss and emotional strain. Her hand rose to her throat, fingers tracing the puncture wounds that still throbbed with a dull, not unpleasant ache. The storm continued outside, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rolling across the mountains. But within Isolde, a different kind of storm was brewing, one made of memory and desire, of fear and hope, of questions that demanded answers and answers that led only to more questions. As she drifted towards sleep, images from Cassian's memories mingled with her own, creating a tapestry of shared experience that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. And beneath it all, a sense of something changing, transforming, not just between them, but within her. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was of the woman in the portrait, dying in Cassian's arms, her golden eyes filled with love even as her life slipped away. "I won't end like her," Isolde promised silently. "I won't let the hunger destroy what's growing between us." But even as the thought formed, another voice seemed to whisper in her mind, ancient, feminine, tinged with both warning and promise. "The hunger is only the beginning. The true test is still to come." Then darkness enfolded her, and she slept, deeply, dreamlessly, while outside the storm raged on. And somewhere in the castle, a vampire prince fought his own battle against hunger, memory, and the growing certainty that his carefully constructed isolation was crumbling beneath the determined assault of one mortal woman's heart.